Now another use for nylon is to create a mesh tube, and then the fibers are blown into that tube. So you get what's referred to as a blown yarn. It's sort of this, it looks almost like a single ply. It's just this one strand, but it's just a mesh tube made out of nylon, and then all the fibers are blown into that tube, and the nylon holds them in place, and it's a very lightweight yarn. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies like knitting, still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. Now the first video of every month is what we call our knit and chat episodes, where we sit with our knitting and we chat about different knitting topics. And this month it is going to be all about synthetic yarns. Now I realize I'm getting late to this topic because we've already covered the other two categories of fibers. There is cellulose or plant fibers, and I also put biosynthetic yarns in there as well because they are plant fiber material. They just take a more synthetic process, but the source material is the same. And then we also discussed protein fibers or animal fibers like wool and silk and cashmere in some previous videos. So I will link to those down below the video or up here in the corner somewhere. And I'll also have a playlist. I'll put these all together in a playlist and link them at the end so you can see all of the different types of fibers that you can use for knitting. In this video, we're going to focus on synthetic fibers like acrylic, but there's others as well. Basically, there's three that we'll talk about that I think are used the most, and we will discuss their pros and their cons and lots of examples of how they look as a yarn and how you would use them and what types of projects you might want to use them for. We'll also discuss how to properly care for projects that use these yarns because they do have their own care needs as well. We're also going to answer some questions. I asked if you had any questions or some advice about using these types of yarns, and there were some questions that were submitted, so we're going to answer those as well. So fibers can be divided into four categories. You've got your protein or animal fibers, like we said, that's wool, silk, cashmere, anything that comes from an animal. And then there are cellulose or plant fibers and also biosynthetic. I put them together. The basic plant fibers like cotton, you could just pull that right off the plant and start spinning and knitting it with it right away. So that's just your cellulose or plant fiber. Then there are biosynthetic fibers like bamboo. You can't just grab some bamboo and start knitting with it. They have to use a synthetic process to break it down to turn it into like fibers that can be used to create yarn. But because the source material is the same, I sort of link it with plant fibers, and they also act the same as other plant fibers. The yarns in the end, whether it's bamboo, cotton, whatever it is, they all sort of have the same properties. And then our third or fourth category is synthetic yarns. Things like acrylic, nylon, polyester, things like that, where they are totally man-made. They don't come from natural resources like from animals or from plants. They are petroleum-based products, and they're completely made in a factory. And the way they're made, I don't really understand the whole process. I haven't dove that deep into the topic, but they all basically are from petroleum-based types of products, and this is turned into some sort of material that is in a big vat, and then that goes through like a spinneret to get the little fibers, and then it can be plied and spun and plied into different types of yarns. And the main goal is to mimic other yarns, especially wool. Like, it was basically created to try to mimic the properties of wool, and it doesn't. I mean, there are a few properties where they are similar, but in the end it's just not the same as wool. But it does have its own pros and cons and reasons you might want to use it. So we're going to discuss all of those as well. But just so you understand, you know, like where it falls in these categories of other, like the different types of yarn. Now, one more thing to note here about synthetic fibers, this is where you'll get novelty yarns as well, like furs and things like that. Because, well, like with animal fibers, you can't change the basic nature of like a merino wool. It's going to always have like the same micron count or staple length or something like that, or the crimp, all of those things. You can't change that beyond crossbreeding different sheep. They're always going to be or have certain characteristics. But with synthetic fibers, that's what they can change all of that. They can make it different staple lengths or change the micron count. Do synthetic fibers have micron counts? I don't know. But they can change all of these different factors with a synthetic fiber based on what they do in the factory. So that's where you get like all the different novelty yarns. You're most likely going to see them as synthetic fibers because they can really have fun with all of these different types of things and change things up with like the different factory tools and settings that they use. And also thank you to Knit Pics. They provided a bunch of yarn for us to look at in this video so we can discuss when you're going to see synthetic yarns or fibers used in a yarn and why they are probably there beyond just like your acrylic. I mean, acrylic is absolutely fine and a good yarn for lots of different uses, but you're going to find synthetic fibers in other blends and used for other things as well. So I want to make sure we discuss all of those. So thank you to Knit Pics for providing this yarn so we have some good examples of how we're going to see synthetic fibers used in different ranges of yarns. So as we do this discussion, we're going to answer your questions as well. And the first one is, what are the different types of synthetic fibers? What are the pros and cons of each? So there's acrylic, polyamide, nylon, and polyester. And those are basically the ones. She's listed them right there. So acrylic, that my example here would be Knit Pics Brava Sport. This is 100% premium acrylic yarn from Knit Pics. So this was made to mimic wool. Like, I mean, that was the whole reason for creating this yarn, was to create something that could replace wool. Does it replace wool? No. Like it has some similarities, but on the whole, it is not enough like wool to be a real replacement for it. But it does serve a purpose, along with nylon and polyamide, which is just another name for nylon, and polyester. They're all the basic same source material. They're all going to have the same pros and cons. Where you're going to see differences is in how they are created. As I said, like that's when they can make all these novelty yarns. They can change like the way the fibers are like cut and spun and plied, and you're going to get different properties depending on what they've done in the factory. But in most cases, they're going to be very inexpensive. I mean, you know, like acrylic is the least expensive yarns available. And that's why also they would include some of these synthetic fibers in other yarn blends to help bring down the price a little bit, make them a little more affordable. And then they are generally soft, but again, that is going to be affected by how that yarn was created in the factory. How was it cut and spun and plied and all of that. And it's very lightweight, it's very durable and strong, and it's easy to care for. Obviously, most of these types of synthetic yarns are machine washable and dryable. You do want to be careful of heat because they are petrochemical based, plastic basically. They can melt. So I don't recommend using them for things like kitchen things, especially where you might want to grab something hot, because they'll melt. Like, don't use it for hot pads or pot holders or things like that, because these fibers are not made for heat. Now, some of the cons, they are water resistant. Now, this might sound like a good thing, but when it comes to like if you get a stain, you need some water in there, and in like whatever soap or you're using to remove that stain is usually is a water-based product, and the fibers are water resistant. They want to resist that water. So sounds like a good thing, but it really isn't. I suppose like if it's a jacket and it's raining outside, then it's gonna like sort of just sit on top. So it can be beneficial in that regard. But when it comes to cleaning it, because it resists water, it can be harder to remove stains. And also, this is where we get that issue with blocking. People say you can't block acrylic because it resists water. If you chuck it in some water like you would your wool sweater, it's not going to absorb the water like the wool is. You kind of have to squish it down in there and make sure it stays underwater and leave it and let it soak. That's one of the things I like to do when I'm washing projects that have been knit with acrylic. I put them in my washing machine, but I leave the lid up so they can soak for a while and give that water time to absorb into those fibers. And that does help it. I mean, it's not going to block like wool. It's not wool, but you have to overcome that water resistance a little bit. So soaking it first can help. And this is also where you can get into lightly steaming it, because that heat, remember, will melt this type of fiber, but that's where you can very gently use some heat to, what they would say, I think, is kill the fibers. You're going to make them stay in place permanently because you're going to melt them basically. So you can use steam or an iron, not touching the project, but sort of hovering over it. But I do find that actually soaking it first before doing any other process to like make it flatten it out can actually be beneficial. So it's also not as breathable as natural fibers. It's not as warm as natural fibers, and it can have a tendency to pill, but that again depends on how it's been spun and plied. Natural fibers can also have that tendency. It really depends on how it's made basically. And like I said, it can be heat sensitive because it can melt because it's basically plastic. And it does have an environmental impact because of what it's made out of, because it's a petroleum based product. We end up, it sheds plastic bits into water supply. Just stating that as a fact. I'm not going to be getting into all of the environmental impacts of other fibers as well, but you just have to be aware it does have an environmental impact. So those are basically the pros and cons you're going to see for these. They're very affordable, very easy to care for, though you do have to sort of figure out that blocking thing. I have a video about that, so I'm going to link to that down below as well. I tested different ways to block synthetic yarns, and I do find that giving them a soak first can help even things out. That's the whole point of like soaking in the water with any project, is to help like even out your stitches. And even doing that with acrylic can do that. Now it's not going to flatten everything out or anything like that, but getting your project wet, even synthetic, and letting it soak for a while can help even out the stitches at least, which is something we want our projects to look nice, and we want the stitches to look nice and even, and that is achievable even with this type of yarn. So we had some questions about that. For me, it is always, how do I block my lovely new synthetic garment to make it look its best? And I haven't knit very much with acrylic yarns. I've knit mostly baby garments and blankets with it. I'd like to know how others steam block acrylic yarn, because I don't think I'm very good at doing that. So most fiber, or most of these synthetic yarns are going to be machine washable and dryable. So we've got that going for us at least. But even doing that, you can still end up with like wonky looking stitches. And if it's something that you want to lay flat and it's not flat, you are going to have to figure out how to do that. So I've linked to that video where I tested different methods so you can see. And the best thing to do is to swatch your yarn and test yourself to see what's going to work best, especially before you take an iron or a handheld steamer to your synthetic fibers. You don't want to accidentally melt your project. Test it on a swatch first. But I do think giving it a nice, good long soak, 30 minutes to an hour maybe, like really let that yarn absorb some water, and that will help those fibers relax. It's not going to flatten everything out, but it'll help the fibers relax. Then you can do the normal wash cycle. Instead of drying it, you could, depending on what you want to do with it, like this blanket here, I wanted to open up all of the flowers and things like that. So I soaked it, and then I let it finish in the machine cycle so it would be pretty much dry. Then I laid it out flat and gently used a steamer with a towel. Put a towel over each flower and then gently steamed it just to try to open it up a little. But that's something to test on a swatch before you do it on your project, because I have accidentally melted different things from too much heat, too much steam. And I use a handheld steamer. I don't think I even own an iron. I prefer just using a steamer. But in the end, they will do the same exact thing, but you just want to be careful when you try it. As for like, taking like a stockinette project that's curling terribly, you might be able to kill that. I mean, you need to have some kind of an edge treatment on that project. Like stockinette's going to curl no matter what fiber it is, and it's going to just do that. And different fibers, you can sort of block it out, but it's going to still at some point probably curl back in. But with synthetic fibers, you can kill it, you can melt it, so it's going to stay the way you want, but I would be very careful about doing that. So let's look at some other blends. I've got some yarns here that have some synthetic fibers in them blended with other fibers for different reasons. Now you're most often going to see this for a few different reasons. It can lower the price of the yarn. So if you've got very expensive fibers, they can reduce the price by adding some synthetic fibers to it as well. It also adds strength and durability or elasticity. There are some fibers that lack some of those elements, especially like plant fibers. They're not very elastic. So you'll often see some synthetic fibers blended with plant fibers because they can add some elasticity to it. They can also make it more lightweight. Plant fibers are generally pretty heavy fibers, and yarns that are 100% plant fibers are more heavy than a yarn that would be like blended with some synthetic fibers instead. Will make it a little more lightweight, which is, in a lot of cases, you want your garments to be on the lightweight side. The heavier they are, the more tendency to sag and droop. And especially with a plant fiber that is not very elastic, it's not going to snap back into place. So these synthetic fibers help reduce those cons of those plant fibers. And synthetic fibers can also add softness. Sometimes plant fibers aren't soft. Sometimes your wool can be really scratchy. So if you want to reduce the amount of wool and add some synthetic fibers to it to make it a little more soft. So let's take a look at some yarns that include synthetic fibers and why they might be added to them. First off, we have Heatherly Worsted. So this is a blend of 80% acrylic, 20% merino. So if we took this one and we took a skein of 100% merino, which one would be less expensive? This one, obviously, because it's 80%, yes, acrylic. Then it has some merino added as well. So you get that softness of the merino, but you get the price of an acrylic yarn. So it's less expensive, but it's still very soft and lightweight. That merino yarn adds its softness. Merino is very lightweight yarn, so you've got a nice light yarn, that blend of merino and acrylic. Then there is Knit Pics Stroll, which is a fingering weight sock yarn. This is a blend of 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. So there we have some nylon. So nylon is added to sock yarns to add some elasticity and some durability, because this is merino wool, which is very soft and cannot be so great for socks because it's so soft. You might get some holes. So we get that nylon in here to add some strength so it will hold up and be a little more sturdy. So along with Stroll, we have Stroll Tweed, which is another blend. This is a 65% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and 10% Donegal tweed. So almost the same, but the addition of the Donegal tweed. So we still have the nylon here to add the durability and the elasticity, so you have a strong pair of socks. And then in that tweed, you can see there's little flecks within this yarn. That is made from acrylic and viscose. So viscose can be made from different like wood sources, beech or birch or lots of other wood sources. So the little flecks of tweed in here are a blend of acrylic and viscose. Then there is this yarn. This is called Snuggle Puff. So this is like a single ply yarn. Now it's a blend of 75% Pima cotton, which is a very soft cotton. There's different types of cotton. I'll link to that video so you can learn more about that. And 25% nylon. So the nylon here would probably be added because cotton is very heavy and it's not very elastic. So nylon is going to make this yarn more lightweight. It's very light and airy feeling, and which is not something that is easy to achieve with cotton on its own. And it's also not very elastic. If you've ever knit with like dishcloth cotton, hard on the hands because there's no give to those fibers. Like if you've used animal fibers, there's a lot of natural give or elasticity. So it's easier for your hands to knit with them because those fibers are moving and stretching. Cotton, especially like that dishcloth cotton, which is not soft at all. It's very hard wearing, good for durable dishcloths, hard to knit with your hands. But we've got this addition of nylon and it makes this very, very lightweight, beautiful single ply yarn. So we have that addition of that nylon to make it weigh less, to make it more easy to knit with. That nylon's going to add some elasticity, so as you're knitting it's going to be a little easier on your hands as well. Now the Knit Pics Comfy yarn line is another blend of cotton and acrylic. This is 75% Pima cotton, 25% acrylic. So instead of the nylon, this one has acrylic. But like the nylon, it adds some elasticity, because it has acrylics have more give, natural give, than plant fibers do. It's also more lightweight, and of course it's going to make the yarn less expensive as well. It's very soft. That's the cotton in there, and acrylics are pretty soft too, depending on how they are created or spun or plied. So with this one, we had nylon blended with it, with our cotton, and with this cotton, we have it blended with acrylic. But either one, I mean, two very different yarns, but those synthetic fibers are there for a reason, to add some elasticity, some lightweightness, or the other attributes of those acrylic or synthetic fibers that can really help your plant fibers work really well for different types of projects. Now, Oceana is a new yarn line. I don't have that one here, but I'm going to put a picture of the yarn here so you can see it. This is a blend of alpaca and polyester SEAQUAL. This is made from upcycled marine plastic. So there's a program that is cleaning the ocean, and they're reusing and recycling the waste and turning it into yarn. So I'll link to their website so you can check out that initiative. But I think that's really cool that they're taking this plastic that's been collecting the ocean, and they are recycling that into a new resource. So this is a blend of alpaca, and this SEAQUAL recycled plastic, basically. So what this is doing, because alpaca is a beautiful fiber on its own, it's very soft, it's very lightweight, but it has so much stretch and elasticity that it will not hold its shape at all. So by blending it with this plastic, basically, it's giving it some structure. This yarn is also a chainette yarn. So that structure of the yarn itself, where it's almost been like turned into a little I-cord, that adds a lot of structure to that alpaca as well. So this is really exciting to see this new line of yarn where they're using recycled waste. Knit Pics has done this with a few different yarn lines. So it's really exciting to see how they're helping and still using yarns that might not be considered as environmentally friendly, but they are finding ways to use them where they're recycled and repurposed. So I think that's a really good, and I need to get this yarn and give it a try. And Wonder Fluff is a yarn that I really like. I'm knitting a cardigan with it right now. So this one is a mesh tube. Now the tube is made out of nylon. So this yarn is 70% baby alpaca, 23% nylon, 7% merino wool. So this is a blown yarn. And what that means is they create this tube, which probably is kind of not so easy to see on here, but it's just a nylon tube, and then they take those fibers, they're all just kind of, I don't know, like just a mass of fibers, the alpaca and the merino, and they are blown into that tube. So what you get is a very, very, very lightweight yarn. And again, alpaca is lightweight and soft and lovely, but it does not have any structure. Like your alpaca 100% garments or whatever you knit with it, it's going to have a lot of drape, which is nice in a shawl, can be nice in a top, but it can keep growing and growing and growing because that's what alpaca does. It has no structure on its own. So by giving it structure, by taking the nylon and making this tube, you're giving it structure. And you're also making a very lightweight yarn. Compare this to like a 3-ply yarn. You're going to get less yardage in that same 100-gram skein because your skeins weigh the same, but you're going to get more of this yarn because it weighs so much less because those fibers are just blown into this tube. So one more example of a synthetic fiber would be the fur yarns, or any, like you get chenilles and all of those fun kind of yarns or novelty yarns like this fur, which is really, really soft. So this is 100% polyester. So polyester is often used to create, so if I can pull out one strand right there, you can see it is just like this little elastic almost. I don't know if you can see that in there. And then it has like this fur attached to it. So polyester is often used to create these different novelty fibers, but it can also act very similar to plant fibers like bamboo, which is, it has a lot in common with silk. Like it has like this really lovely drape and shine like you see with silk. Some plant fibers have that as well, and polyester does too. So it's really neat how they can make so many different things with it. You can get all of these fun novelty type yarns with polyester, but it can also mimic some of like silk or some of these plant fibers where you get this lovely drape and sheen. So you're going to see polyester used in different ways in yarns as well. This is just one example, this fun fur, which would really be cute on like the brim of a hat. Now, as far as the types of projects, it's really going to vary from yarn to yarn. Your 100% acrylics, they're meant to be used to replace, like if a project calls for wool, you can probably replace it with an acrylic yarn. Is it going to be exactly the same? No, but it's going to be fairly close. It's a good source for those who have wool allergies and they want something easy to care for. Acrylics, or where they're added to with plant fibers, because plant fibers are generally machine washable as well. You're going to get some easy care yarns in there that you can use for like summer knits or baby knits. But all of these, I mean, they're combined with sock yarns or these blown yarns. Like, they're just so many uses. You can use them any way you're going to use your natural fibers as well. And some other uses like these novelty yarns, because they can be made with these man-made materials, and it's harder to make these with the natural plant or animal fibers. But you can use them in any projects that you would use your wool or your plant fibers. So let's get to some of your questions that we still haven't addressed yet. Krista, this second half, here it is. So here's my question. What attributes to look for in an acrylic yarn that would make it good to make a sweater out of? I've never knitted a sweater before and would like to try it on this cheap yarn I have before I buy nicer stuff. So this really depends on the sweater that you want to knit. Acrylic yarns come in so many different varieties, but I think what you want to do is come at it from the other end. Think about the sweater that you want to knit first. Is it a cabled sweater? Lots and lots of cables going on. You can definitely use acrylic for that. You don't want to use some fluffy thing like this. You would want to use a standard plied acrylic, because that's going to make those cables stand out. You're not going to want to use something probably like a blown yarn, because it's going to be very fuzzy and soft. You might want that if it's just, you just want a nice soft fuzzy sweater and there's not a lot of texture going on that you want to see. Like in a cable sweater, you generally want to see those cables. They're going to be harder to see in some fluffy yarn. So choose a plied yarn. So I would come at it from that direction. Like, look at the sweater you want to knit first, and what kind of yarn is going to best suit that type of sweater. Okay, next question from the Buzzy Bumblebee. I'm new to the yarn world and have only worked with a few yarns, mostly acrylics or acrylic blends. My question is, do natural fibers split as much as acrylic? Do you or others have tips to help prevent acrylic yarn splitting? This is how the yarn is spun and plied. If it's a very, high twist, really good strong twist to that yarn, it's going to be hard to split it. More loosely spun and plied yarns, more likely to have some split. And that really has nothing to do with the fiber content. That could be any yarn at all. So it's more in how that yarn was turned into, like how it was spun and plied, basically, is going to affect how splitty the yarn is. Now, I've used plenty of yarns that split. You just learn to deal with it, I guess. You can change the type of needle tip you use. Like, if you find you're using very sharp tips and it splits your yarn all the time, perhaps test out some needle tips that are a little more blunt and see if that will help you knit without splitting the yarn so much. But it crosses the fiber barrier. All fibers can be splitty. It depends on the structure and construction of the yarn itself. Charbear asks, what exactly is polyamide and how does it perform after washing? I've heard horror stories about it looking matty after washing and drying. So polyamide is just another name for nylon. So nylon was the original name like DuPont came up with when they invented it. But polyamide is just like another word for nylon. But now we use nylon as like that catch-all term. Even though it is sort of like the trademarked brand name, they're the same exact thing, just different names. Now, I have not seen this issue with like things getting matted when I use nylon. Nylon is usually in there for a reason. You're going to see it in sock yarns because it adds durability and elasticity. Same with other yarns as well. But if you're concerned, swatch. That's always going to be my answer, is swatch and see what happens. Depending on how you care for it, it might not like to be hit. Maybe there's a certain one where your temperature maybe on your dryer is too high, and that's going to affect how that nylon acts, because these synthetic yarns are petrochemical based. They are plastics. They can melt at high heats. So it could be like the heat of your dryer even, and you might want to test at a different temperature. Oh, and Charbear also had another question. I heard acrylic stretches, then I heard wool stretches. So is this another reason why people add a strand of cashmere or mohair? I want to make the big Sophie scarf, but I want to pick a yarn that won't pill, but that won't pill but won't stretch. I considered wool, then wondered about Premier, anti-pill, DK, or worsted. So acrylic and wool, they're both going to stretch because that's just the nature of those fibers, but they're elastic. So in general, they're going to go back to their original shape. But again, that can depend on how the yarn was spun or plied or anything like that. The most I can suggest again is to swatch with the yarn that you would like to try. You're going to get pilling with wool or with acrylic. Again, that depends on how it's been spun and plied. A more loosely spun and plied yarn is more likely to pill. A more tightly plied and spun yarn is less likely to pill, because the tighter those fibers are twisted together, the less abrasion they're getting against each other. The looser it is, the more they move and shift and touch each other, and can cause more pilling and abrasion. So again, that's not with the fibers so much as with how the yarn is constructed. So in that case, again, you just have to swatch and see how it's going to be. But hand knit garments are going to pill. All of mine do. I mean, I think my plant fibers actually pill less than some of, but they shed. Some of them, like linen, seems to shed some. So I think it's just, that's the nature of knitting. Like with these soft fibers, you're going to have certain things that are just part of the process and are just going to happen, like pilling and yarn splitting. That just happens. So I hope you have a better understanding of these yarns and how they knit up and how you can use different synthetic fibers, even if you prefer natural fibers. Sometimes these synthetic yarns, or the addition of these synthetic fibers, have a place when it comes to knitting, especially something like a blown yarn. Like, I mean, you need that nylon tube to get that really lightweight, lovely yarn. So they have their place, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you knit with synthetic fibers? Do you try to avoid them? That we're not going to get into a big debate on the environmental impact, because all yarns have some, more or less, depending on that. We're just not going to get into that. That's a personal choice between you and your knitting, and I'm not here to judge you on what you use. But it is something we can discuss if you want to discuss it down in the comments. And we have discussed the other fibers, the plant or cellulose fibers and the animal or protein fibers. I always call them animal and plant because I just think it's so much easier. But I've put these videos, there's 3 of them now, all together in one playlist, so you can refer back to them or watch them as you need to, so you can learn more about these different fibers and how they can be a part of your knitting journey. So you can click right there, and I'll see you in the next video.